Hi all, and welcome to the Midland Public Library's virtual author visit with Brian Francis. My name is Jennifer Paquette, and I'm the Adult and Teen Services Coordinator here at MPL, and I'm happy to be here, your host for this event. We also have with us a few of the youth leads from the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub. This interview is a special collaboration between MPL and the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub in celebration for their launch week. Our interview is being pre-recorded and will be available online through the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub social media sites and website, as well as the library's website. We'd also like to mention our questions today have been developed in collaboration with local youth who have submitted their questions either via social media or through email. From Brian's website, here's a little bit of description about him. Brian Francis is a Canadian author based out of Toronto. His most recent work, a play called Box 4901, co-created with Rob Kempson, premiered to a sold-out audience earlier in 2020. His most recent novel, Breaking Case of Emergency, was a finalist for the 2019 Governor General's Literary Awards, and that's just the beginning of its accolades and the others accumulated by his works, including his first novel, Fruit, which was a 2009 Canada Reads finalist. Brian also writes a monthly writing advice column, Ask the Agony Editor, for Quill and Choir magazine, a retro recipe column called The Kitsch for Tattle Creek magazine, and is a regular contributor to CBC Radio's The Next Chapter. On behalf of the Midland Public Library and the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub, join me in welcoming Brian Francis. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here today.
We're so thrilled that you could be part of the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub's launch week. As you know from our previous conversations, the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub is about bringing the right services to youth and their families at the right time in the right place, improving Ontario's mental health and addictions services for youth and young adults. When describing your most recent novel, the Globe and Mail said that Breaking Case of Emergency beautifully explores the issues around mental health and suicide in a story that packs a powerful punch. Can you start us off by giving a brief overview of the book?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. So the book, Breaking Case of Emergency, is set in 1992. So for some young readers, that might seem like it was a long time ago, but for someone of my age, it just seems like yesterday. But in 1992, and it takes place on a dairy farm in a fictionalized town called Tilden. And the main character is Toby Goodman. She's 15 years old. And Toby is still reeling from the death of her mother, who died by suicide when Toby was only 10. And Toby has decided that she's fated to follow a similar path as her mom. She feels that there is no light in her world. She feels that she has no value to anyone around her. She feels like she's a nuisance to everybody. And so she sort of makes plans to follow in similar footsteps as her mother. Before that happens, though, she's told by her grandmother that her long-lost father, someone who she's never met before, has decided to return home to Tilden to finally meet her after 15 years. And then she finds out also that not only is her father returning, but he's also gay. And not only is he gay, he's also a female impersonator. So not the typical, father character coming back into someone's life. And he shows up and is just a mess, not a very good parent figure at all. In fact, in many ways comes across more as the child than Toby does. And basically just does not give her the recognition that I think she feels that she really needs from him, the validation for who she is. And basically I don't want to give too much of the story away, but the story, I think, for me, is a story about forgiveness. And it's about forgiving the people that we love that always don't give us back what we think that we are entitled to or what we deserve in terms of two-way emotion, but also learning to forgive ourselves. And that's something that Toby deals with a lot. She has not forgiven herself for what she feels is letting her mother down. And she felt that she needed to take care of her mother. And she feels that she has let her mother down. And so she needs to find a way to forgive herself for who she is and for not being a superhero, and just acknowledging the fact that people will do things in life that you don't always that are really hard to deal with, but that doesn't mean that you can't find a space to kind of move on from that and to deal with it. So that's kind of what the story's about in my mind anyway. Other readers might take different messages away, but for me, it's ultimately a story about forgiveness and forgiving the people that you love, but also forgiving yourself sometimes for being human.
And can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
Yeah, so I mean, this book has been a long time coming. I would like to tell everybody that, look, it takes like a year to write a book, and that's not the case. So much of the creative process is me really struggling to find out what I want to write and what the characters are and what their purpose is. I originally kind of started the book with the character of Arthur, who was the father, and sort of trying to expand on that. But it's funny when you write, and anyone who's listening to this and writes themselves, it's not like you're always in control of your stories. I mean, sometimes the stories kind of control you, and that's sort of a weird way to look at it. But sometimes I think of it like, when you have like a seance, right, where you sort of open yourself up to spirits, I guess. I don't want to get too paranormal or anything, but you, as part of the creative process, you need to open yourself up to different characters and different voices, and you need to be able to sort of channel those characters through you. So I didn't set off to write the character of Toby at all, but she came into the story. And once I kind of landed on her, I knew that she was meant to be this story. I knew that her perspective and her voice was the more compelling voice to tell the story through. So it took a lot of time for me to get to that point. Honestly, it was probably about 7 years of me writing really not the right story before I landed on the right story. So that's kind of how it came to be. So Toby kind of needed to come to me into my head before I was able to really sort of move forward on the next steps and finish the story, and so that it's similar to what you are now reading in its book form, but it took a long time to get there.
It's funny that you say that, because I loved the character of Arthur for so many different reasons, especially because of the female impersonators that I've met in my life. He's just so bang on of some of the
It's funny too, because like, I know for me, like the whole, like the drag queen thing has exploded so much. And my niece, who is, I guess she's 16 now, like took me to see RuPaul's Drag Race when the show came to Toronto. And I'm like, this is like, my niece is taking her gay uncle to see a drag show. Like, it's just like, this is a brave new drag queen world. But yeah, I think that there's certainly a lot more celebration around that and acceptance and respect for that craft than maybe there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think that it's nice to see that kind of recognition and that response, especially among younger people, for that craft, because I know RuPaul, that whole Drag Race, the show, but also online as well, there's such a fan base for a lot of those artists, and I think it's well deserved.
Yes, definitely. And the fact that you had started, writing from Arthur's, like the novel started with him and his story. One of the things that sort of left me not wanting more, but we get really just a glimpse of his life, and I feel like it's just, I want to know more about him. I want to know more about his life, just me personally having read it. So it's funny that you mentioned that that's how it started. So you say that it started with Arthur, and then, Toby kind of worked her way into the story. Is that how you fell into writing a young adult novel, or what motivated you to get into the YA realm?
I didn't do it intentionally. And if I went to do it, if I started intentionally, that probably the book would not be as good, or would be much different, because I'd be too self-conscious about writing a YA book. My first book, Fruit, was told through the voice of a 13-year-old protagonist. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So Fruit was like, Peter's 13 and it's told in his voice. I never set out to write a young adult book with that, and it wasn't marketed that way. Now, it's interesting, like that came out in 2004. So if Fruit were to come out today, would it be marketed as a YA book? And I don't know. I think the genre, as you probably know, Jennifer, there's so much like the world of YA has just kind of exploded in terms of the topics and the voices and the diversity and the different experiences that are being recognized and validated, I think, in a lot of YA books. So in a lot of ways, it feels in some ways like it's my second YA book, but this book was my first intentional YA book, I guess, knowing that I was writing to a very specific audience. And I fell into it. I think once I realized that Toby was really sort of the star of the show, that's when it fell into place more in terms of me understanding that what I was writing was a book that obviously hopefully talked to adult readers and that they were able to relate to it, but clearly was speaking to a younger reader intentionally. So I kind of fell into it, to be honest with you.
There are a few differences between you and Toby Goodman. You've identified a couple of them, but can you speak to what it was like to write outside of your lane and from the perspective of a 15-year-old girl?
Yeah, it was scary. I mean, for me, I think, the one thing that you're always afraid of as a writer is for somebody to come back to you and say, well, you got that all wrong. Like that's not reflective of my experiences, or you've overstretched your limits. I think that risk is part of it. And when I decided it was going to be from Toby's point of view, I was really scared because I thought, what if I get her wrong? What do I know? And so part of it is understanding and doing research and understanding sort of where you're coming from, but also part of it's kind of just letting go of your inhibitions and seeing what you come out with. And it doesn't mean you're always going to be right. Like it doesn't mean that just because you're taking a risk, it's always going to pay off. But sometimes when you take that risk, it does pay off. So I think coming from a place of knowledge and understanding, but I think more than anything, it's that sense of empathy. Like I really felt for Toby and her experiences and how she felt. And I hope other readers would be able to empathize with her as well. I mean, that's kind of, for me, the basis for all good writing is that I don't always have to agree with the characters. I don't always have to like the characters, but I have to be able to empathize with the characters. Like I have to understand why they're thinking the way that they are, why they're feeling the way that they are, the decisions that they make, the reasons behind those decisions. And so once I was able to really get under Toby's skin, it kind of helped me explore her character a little bit more.
Staying on the topic of Toby, for another question, she goes through a lot. She's got a lot to contend with: an absentee father, the death of a parent by suicide, her own mental health challenges, and now she's faced with that absentee father sort of trying to establish a relationship with her. Why was it important to have Toby navigate those specific challenges? And in one case of a question from a youth is like, did you draw on any personal experience for putting those challenges in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I intentionally didn't sort of set out to give her all these obstacles. To my point earlier, when I was talking about the characters kind of come to you, the stories kind of come to you as well. And so as Toby kind of became more and more real in my mind, her story became more sort of fleshed out. And writing from the perspective of Toby at 15, but also writing from the perspective of all the things that have happened in her life, that was another area where I got really nervous about writing from, because I thought, well, she's dealing with so much. Certainly I have, I come from a family where there has been mental health issues for sure. Nothing for me personally to the extent of what Toby is facing in her life, but I think, where I found my connection with her was in that sense of alienation and isolation that she feels, certainly being a teenager. Like I know for myself, there was this sense that I couldn't reveal who I was as a person to anyone, right? I couldn't never let my authentic self out when I was Toby's age because I was afraid of everyone's rejection. And that certainly was, me being in the closet, but also just being insecure about my own issues. And I think in a lot of ways, Toby and I have that common ground where we feel like if we revealed who we authentically were, if we really talked openly about our struggles, that we would be met with silence and misunderstanding. And I know for my case, that wasn't the end result. Luckily, it didn't happen in my teenage years, but much later. But that's something that was important for me for Toby to experience, that when she does kind of reach out her hand for help, that there's somebody else there to take her hand and to help. And so that was an important message for me to include as part of her experience as well.
Which is why it ties so nicely into this launch week for the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub.
Mm-hmm.
Tilden looks a lot like Midland, Ontario, in many ways. Why set your novel in a place like Tilden?
I've never been to Midland, so I'm glad to know that I've captured it. For me, I grew up in a city called Sarnia, which is sort of on the southwestern end of the province, and it's kind of that mid-sized city. And I think for me, I like exploring smaller cities. I don't know, there's something about them that I find really interesting in terms of the characters, in terms of their environment. I think if Toby was growing up in Toronto, for example, in 1992, she'd have a very different experience than she's having in Tilden in 1992. I think the lack of sometimes the awareness, and keep in mind too, this is 1992, so it's before the age of the internet where you have access to all this information. And I know I was very limited in my understanding of the world growing up in Sarnia, pre-internet days. I mean, you really just have the television as your main means of the outside world, right? And that, as we know, was not hardly ever an accurate representation of the real world, especially when it comes to TV shows. So I wanted Tilden to kind of be, I think, reflective in some ways of the sense of isolation that Toby felt, but also a lot of, teenagers will feel. You don't necessarily always choose where you live, and where you live might not always have the diversity and the range of experiences and the range of voices that you would like it to have as well. So it's kind of reflective, I think, of Tilden in my mind is reflective of my own experiences growing up and that lack of otherness that I didn't feel myself. It was very much sort of the same, and I struggled with that a lot growing up. So I wanted Toby to be in an environment similar to that because I could relate to how she was relating to the world around her. And putting her on a dairy farm just kind of added to that further sense of isolation, because kids who grew up in the country, I think, sometimes do deal with more of that sense of isolation because they're not sort of in an urban core, they're sort of removed from that. So that was another way for me also to highlight that sense of isolation that Toby feels.
Nice. As librarians and youth workers, we think it's important for people, especially youth, to see themselves reflected in the books that they read and in the media that they consume. Do you agree? And who did you hope, you've touched on this already a little bit, who did you hope would see themselves in Break in case of emergency, and what message did you hope to convey?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I think youth need to see themselves reflected. I struggled with myself growing up. I never saw myself, and that in a lot of ways was sort of the impetus behind Fruit, my first book, which was sort of telling the story of this 13-year-old kid who was coming to terms in a very kind of weird way with being gay at 13 in the mid 80s. I was so angry, I think, when I wrote that book, not angry as in like, typing away, but I was so desperate, I think, to see my own experiences reflected back in a book, because I had never experienced that before. And the closest maybe would be like Judy Blume books. Like I kind of related more to the stories that she was, obviously they're awesome stories, but I never saw myself and reflected in any books. And so it was important for me to write Fruit because it was me saying to myself, you existed, like this was your experiences. I'm authenticating what you're experiencing. So for my own experience, I know that how important it is for youth to see their own experiences validated and authenticated and represented in books, in movies, on TV, because when you see yourself recognized, it makes you feel less alone. Like you're not as solitary as you think. And I think that was the worst thing for me growing up, is when you don't see yourself reflected back at you, you think you're the only one. You think you're the only one who's dealing with these problems. You think you're the only one who sees themselves this way. And if you're not ever given an alternative to that, then of course you would think that. Like you would think that you are the only one. And so Yes, absolutely. For youth to see, and to see the range of their experiences reflected, back at them, because it's not just one experience. It's not, people tend to lump teenagers into kind of like this group, this group of people. And within that group, there are so many different experiences that all of them are having. I think it is important to have that reflected back to them. Absolutely. Because I do think you send a message. I mean, to your question about what is the ultimate message that I wanted people to readers to come away with, it's more sort of that sense that there is hope, and that there are people out there, and you might not know who those people are. You might not have met them personally. You might not know their names, but there are people out there that are like you and want to help you in some way. And books and film and whatever it might be is a great way for people to be reminded of that, that if I'm thinking this way and I'm writing this book, it means that somebody else potentially understands me and understands sort of where I'm coming from. So it's that common ground, I think. And I hope that for me would be one of the main messages that I hope a reader takes away, is the message of hope, but also that they are not alone in whatever they're dealing with, their struggles, although it might seem like it at the time.
You're here. uh, and that light bulb moment when you're reading a book and you see something that you thought you were the only one, or the only way that you thought about one thing, and you see that on the page, you're like, oh, you have that light bulb moment.
It's kind of a weird, like, it's that weird kind of scary moment too, where you're like, how does this author get inside my head? How do they know that I was thinking about this? But that just shows you the common experience, right, among so many of us in our, I guess, kind of our private worlds. Like, it's the worlds that we don't share with other people, and that we don't talk about, but are the ones sometimes that we're wanting to express more than others. And for me, like, books are such a great way to tap into that sort of private world, because it's just a one-on-one relationship that the reader has with the book. Like, you're not reading, you're not collectively reading a book together the same way that you would see a movie or you'd be watching TV. Like, a book is, for the most part, it's a one-on-one relationship that book has to the person who's reading it. So it's a much more kind of intimate bond, I think, in some ways than other forms. And I think when those light bulb moments go off, to your point, they can be that much more powerful, because it is much more of an intimate experience between the reader and the book that they're reading. And so when those moments happen, it just has a way of bringing a lot of clarity, hopefully, to people, so that, again, the message is that you are not alone in feeling this way at all. Even though you might not have ever said this to anybody, you are not alone in your world.
Switching gears a little bit to talk about your writing life. The writing process can be very unique from writer to writer. Can you tell us a little bit about yours? Like, for example, do you outline everything, or you just write what you feel, and do you set aside specific goals for how many pages per day, or what times during the day that you're going to write? And one of our youth, Marika particularly, was interested in how you deal with procrastination.
Procrastination. Okay, so I will say this, that there's no right way to be a writer. So if you are somebody who meanders and just kind of goes on these journeys with your characters, you're not really sure what the story is, that's okay. If you're somebody who lays out all your plot points and brings in the characters later, that's okay as well. I think both have their pros and cons. I tend to be a character writer, and so I am drawn more to people and characters. And then where I struggle is I'm not sure what to do with those characters. So to the point we were talking about earlier was, what do I do with these characters? What do I do with Toby? What's kind of the story around her? Because she was always like, I had a good sense of who Toby was and who Arthur was and who the grandparents were. Like, everybody that's in the story I understood. I just didn't know what to do with them. And so I'm not really much of a plot writer. And other writers are heavy on the plot, but sometimes the characters, they don't spend enough time developing the characters. So those are like those page turner books where you're kind of like, you're reading through really quickly. And then at the end of the day, you're kind of like, well, that character didn't really stand out for me, or I just felt like I was there for the plot. So there's kind of two extremes. One is all characters and nothing ever happens in the book. And then there's the other side of it, which is the plot-driven book, where you kind of like all these characters just feel like cardboard cutouts to me. The best is finding the balance between the two. So you've got an interesting book that people like reading with really richly developed characters that feel true and authentic. How you get there is the big question. So for me, as I said, I've spent a lot of time working on books that never kind of went anywhere, even though the characters stayed the same, because I didn't really have a sense of where the character was going, or where the story was going. So I would recommend to any aspiring writers out there to try to put as much thought in advance to your writing before you actually sit down to write. Like, try to plot it out, try to get a sense of where the story is going to end, because typically what happens, and I know for myself this would happen a lot, especially in my younger years, is I would have a great idea for a short story, for example, and I would sit down to start writing it, and then I'd get halfway through and I'm like, well, I don't know where this story's going to end. So then it just kind of fizzled out, and you don't do anything more. Like, there's so many stories that you start but you don't finish, because you don't know before you sit down where the story is going to go. So I would recommend for some writers to try to give as much thought, and that's something that I'm trying to bring about in my own writing, because I acknowledge that's a fault on my end too, that I need to give more thought to the entire story before I start sitting down and sort of spinning my wheels talking about characters and not really sure what I want to do with them, or what situations I want to put them in. In terms of the procrastination, I mean, I will say this, that a lot of the times aspiring writers will think that their writing is terrible, which is not a good attitude to have. So allow yourself to write badly. It's a first draft. Nobody needs to see it. You can be as cliche as you want to be. Talk about the sunset looking like every single cliche that you can think of. Give all your characters really bad dialogue, because it helps you kind of move it along. Where I would stumble, and where I think a lot of us writers stumble, is I'm trying to be perfect with the first sentence. I'm trying to be perfect with the first paragraph, with the first page. And that's what trips you up. And that's what creates the procrastination, is because you're not giving yourself permission to be bad. And I'm not showing my first draft to anybody. My first draft is to me. It's me telling myself the story. Second draft is about me crafting it for a reader. So I have to be confident in that story. So I think sometimes what happens with procrastination is a lot of writers will find a reason not to write because they don't think what they're working on is very good. And they're very hard on themselves. And so my message to anyone who's procrastinating is ask yourself if that's why you're procrastinating, and give yourself the opportunity to be bad, and get that first draft out and get it locked down. And then you can look at refining it as you go along. And the more you feel in control of the story, the less procrastination kind of weighs on you, because now you have a purpose. You have an understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Authors often write for specific audiences or for themselves, like you've mentioned, but almost never for awards or accolades. But what does it mean to you as a writer to have your work recognized in the way that it has?
It's a great feeling. I mean, you can't put too much emphasis on it, because if you pay attention to all the good stuff, it means you have to pay attention to all the bad stuff, right? I mean, it's understanding that a lot of it sometimes comes down to luck. Having a book come out at the right time in the right place, and having the right readers pick it up, and that word of mouth, starts to spread, and this book becomes a huge success. And oftentimes it's because the book is very good, but a lot of the times there's really good books that don't get any recognition at all. They don't get nominated for any awards. They don't make any bestseller lists. And so what's the message to those authors then? It's like, well, your book isn't very good, but that's not the case. So I think sometimes you have to figure in that it's luck, and that the more you put yourself out there, the more you increase those chances of good fortune kind of coming in your direction. But the recognition is always, it's great. I mean, you work really hard on a book. Like it took me a long time to write this. A lot of self-doubt came into it as I was working on it. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to finish it. So when I finish it, and then it gets published, and then you get recognized, like for the Governor General, it's a very proud moment, because it makes me feel like I've done something, like something that I thought I wasn't going to be able to do came out, and it's something that I'm proud of. So it does help the recognition. Absolutely. You just can't depend on that recognition to validate whether you're good or not, because that's not how it works.
Do you find that it applies any pressure? Like, do you feel pressure for the next?
A little bit, sure. But I think I put the most pressure on myself. Like I don't know. I'm not one of those perfectionist people. Like I'm not somebody who is really obsessing over word choices and descriptions. I'm somebody who's trying to write something that is as relatable and enjoyable to a reader as possible. So sure, there's always a bit of pressure that I'm putting on myself, but at the same time, I'm my own biggest critic. And so if I don't like it, I'm not putting something out there that I wouldn't be able to sort of stand behind either.
We all know that it's an incredibly long road and difficult to get into publishing, especially in Canada. So Terry wonders how you broke through to get your first book published.
Well, okay. So for my first book, which was Fruit, again, I tried sending it out to some editors and got like no response, like nobody. One of the editors said, I don't know who the audience is for this book. And I was like, well, I'm the audience for this book. And if I'm the audience for this book, there has to be other people that are out there that are like me that want to read a book like this. Generally speaking, you try to get an agent. That's really hard to do because agents are not easy to get for first-time novelists, because a lot of the time you have to sort of prove yourself in some ways that you're going to be worth their time and their investment, because a lot of time will go into having an agent represent your work. For Fruit, I thought I was really clever. So I'll tell you what I did. So when I was trying to get an agent for Fruit, I came up with this scheme where I was going to get all this attention from an agent, where I identified, I think it was like 3 or 4 agents in Toronto. And on day 1, they were each delivered an apple with the first line of the book. And then on day 2, they got an orange with the second line of the book. And day 3, they got like a banana. And on the 5th day, they got a whole pineapple with the first 20 pages of the book or whatever. So I'm going to tell you now, I did not hear back from any one of those agents at all. They probably thought, who's this weird guy who's sending us fruit every day, this rotting bananas or whatever. So in spite of whatever good intentions or clever ideas or whatever you think you have that's going to get you some attention, it doesn't always work. That's not to say you shouldn't be pursuing those ideas, because you never know what's going to stick. So for me, I just got beaten down a lot by just a lot of rejection, which is what a lot of first-time authors feel and experience. Eventually, the book got picked up by a mid-sized publisher called ECW Press, and I work with them directly, so I didn't work with an agent on it. And they were great to work with. They were awesome, very much guided me through the process, involved me at every stage of the way. So it was a very positive experience. And then, of course, it went on to Canada Reads, which was great for me, obviously, but also great for them, too, because it just boosted those sales of that book considerably, being on that list. So that was kind of just a nice moment for me. And again, like it's a message that I want to make sure that gets out to aspiring writers, is that I had everybody reject the book, that I sent it to, except for a couple of publishers eventually. And then the book went on to be on Canada Reads, in this incredible list of books. So it really is just one person's opinion that can sometimes make or break your career, and I don't want to say break your career. That sounds kind of like, like doomsday or whatever, but all it takes is one person to say, yes, I believe in you. Yes, I'm going to give you this chance to really give you that head start. But you have to have a lot of perseverance, and you have to really believe in yourself, because if you don't believe in yourself and your work, then why am I going to spend my time reading your book? Like if you're not confident that that you are worth my time as a reader, then why would I bother? So I think a lot of writers just need to get over being apologetic, being like thinking my work isn't all that good. You really just need to believe in yourself, and eventually things will start to come together.
As a side note, I remember the exact moment that I came across Fruit. I was in university at the University of Ottawa, and there's a little independent bookstore there called Perfect Books, and it was on the on the display. And I don't know if it was maybe it was around the Canada Reads time, but how can you not pick up a book that's, subtitle is a novel about a boy and his nipples? I was like, oh yes, please, I need this. So it's so funny how things like that like just stick in your mind. Yeah, funny. You've touched on a lot about your advice for young writers, and Belle had asked, and you've touched on it took seven years to get through to write Break in Case of Emergency. How long did it take for you to write Fruit from sort of conception to final product?
They've all taken around 6, I would say 5 to 7 years, all of them. I think Fruit was maybe a little bit shorter because, like, in terms of the turnaround time, because it was sort of mirroring a lot of my own life and my own experiences. So I was drawing from a place that felt very familiar to me, so I could just kind of pull it out. It was all sort of there. It just needed to be sort of structured, and it needed to be a book, right? Which is, it's not like you can just throw out these random memories and put them on a page. You need to give that sense of structure. So that for me, and because I was not familiar with writing a book, that was for me was the kind of the biggest challenge with Fruit. The source material was there, but I needed to create a book out of it. My second book, Natural Order, took a long time because that was kind of building it from the ground floor up. There wasn't that sort of well that I was drawing on. The same with Break in Case of Emergency. Like, I think sometimes the biggest challenge is feeling like you're confident in the story and you know these characters, and that can take a while. So while I wrote for 7 years, that was probably about 5 years of wrong writing and 2 years of right writing. And what I mean by that is it took me 5 years to understand what it was that I was trying to tell in terms of the story. And once I knew that, it really took only a couple of years to sort of put it together. So for my next book, I'm trying to eliminate those 5 years and just skip ahead to the 2. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but wishful thinking on my part, I guess.
That leads me right into my next question, which is, what are you working on now?
So the book I'm working on right now is a memoir. So the play that you referenced before, Box 4901, is kind of based on my early years when I was 21 years old and kind of coming out. And so the book that's coming out next year is based on that idea. So it's my first memoir. It's a collection of nonfiction essays. And that's a new experience for me because as a fiction writer, you can kind of tell the truth, but you hide it under the mask of fiction. And this is the complete opposite. You need to be as accurate as you can, but also understanding where that line of fiction comes into it, because I don't want to say anything that's not true, but at the same time, I need to sort of recreate moments from my life that I need to sort of fictionalize in some way or embellish so that the reader feels like they're more part of that scene as it's kind of unhappening, as it's rolling out, as it's happening in real time. So it's been a real interesting experience to kind of balance between the two worlds of fiction and nonfiction and figuring out where the comfort zone for me lies as predominantly a fiction writer.
And that's due out next year?
Yeah, that's scheduled to come out in June. I mean, obviously with COVID and everything, I think it's kind of thrown a lot of the publishing schedules into, like, everyone's just kind of like trying to figure out as they go along. So originally it was supposed to come out in February 2021, and they've pushed it now to June 2021. So provided everything goes okay, it should be out at that point next year, but who knows? It just feels like everything's so, like, everyone's just taking it day by day, right? And so with publishing, I think the whole spring season was just kind of, I would think, was thrown into chaos. I'm sure books got delayed that were supposed to come out. And I know it's been a real struggle for a lot of festivals and stuff as they sort of move online, like these in-person readings and stuff. Like it's taken on a new form. And in some ways it's good because you can connect with people in a way maybe that you wouldn't have been able to connect with them in person. For example, like, me being in Midland today, at least virtually. But in other instances, people also like that one-on-one personal connection, right? To have your book signed, to meet the author, to approach them and have a conversation with them. And I think there's pros and cons to either side, but it's just such a weird time now for so many people and so many industries as well.
Definitely. Taking it day by day, because that's all we can do at this point. But yes, we have patrons who are on both sides of that camp, really missing those sort of book tour opportunities with, getting books signed and things like that. but then the other half enjoying the convenience of being able to link up to a virtual visit.
Yeah, for sure.
And what are you reading now? Us librarians always love to ask that sort of question.
To be honest with you, when I'm in my writing mode, I tend not to read very much just because whatever spare time I have is always spent on the writing. I have read, I've been on a bit of a horror kick this past summer. And I finished a book that was very good called The Changeling by Victor, and I don't know Victor's last name. I know the first name. It came out a couple of years ago. But it's a supernatural book that takes place in modern day New York City and sort of brings in mythology and brings in sort of this fantastic world. And it was just different than anything that I'd read recently. So if anyone's looking for kind of an escape book or a book that really blends together the real world with a fantasy world or the supernatural side of things, I recommend the Changeling.
All right, that's great. It is definitely a great time of year to be reading that kind of fiction for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Brian, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. Your book was very moving and full of characters, the whole cast of them, who are complex, sensitive, beautiful, realistic, and very memorable. There's one scene in particular that I think I'll never forget. That we are so grateful to be able to share it with our community, and especially as a part of this launch here. And we thank our audience for joining us and for watching. You can definitely find a copy of Break in Case of Emergency here at MPL to check out, or at a library or bookstore near you. If you find yourself needing help, call into the Hub phone line at 705-427-5639, and Hub staff can provide you some navigation support and a warm handoff to our other Hub partners and community services. As Brian's mentioned, you are not alone. There's somebody there who is willing to provide help and to listen. And don't forget to follow the library and the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub on all of our socials, including details for other events that are happening during the North Simcoe Youth Wellness Hub's launch this week. Thank you again, Brian. I appreciate your time. It's been fantastic, and we wish you all the best and can't wait to see what you do next.
Thanks, Jennifer. I appreciate the invitation and best of luck with everything.
Thank you. Take care.